Welcome to Linda's Corner. My name is Linda Bjork. In today's podcast, we're going to be discussing the importance and benefits of following our intuition. I feel so fortunate to have a special guest with me today, Sunil Godse, who has spent thousands of hours on research and interviews to become an expert on this subject. Sunil feels strongly that the reason we make bad decisions is because we ignore our intuition. On his webpage, he shares some of his own life experiences where he ignored his intuition, which led to some things that he deeply regrets, like wasting 3 years in the wrong career, losing his life savings because of a bad client, and, most regrettably, being unable to prevent a good friend from being shot and killed. These experiences led him to begin researching so he could find answers that would help himself and others make better decisions in their lives. He has developed a 7-step process that shows people how to sharpen their intuition so they can be happier and more successful. He has shared his message in a TED Talk, and he's written a book called Gut that he offers for free on his website, intuitionology.com. And I'm so grateful that he's here to share his expertise with us today. Welcome, Sunil. Thank you for joining with me today.
Thanks for having me as a guest. I'm really excited for this opportunity, and hopefully I'm going to help educate your listeners on the importance of listening to intuition and what they can do today to start that process.
Oh, yes, please. Take it away.
Perfect. And so I'll kind of give you a bit of the backstory as to how I came into really researching intuition. It came really after I wrote my first book called Fail Fast, Succeed Faster. And the nature of that book, the premise of that book, is that if you are in business or as an entrepreneur, then if you learned the lessons from others, then you should theoretically succeed faster because they're already telling you what the mistakes they made. So don't repeat them. And so when I started going on stages talking about that, one of the key questions I used to get from entrepreneurs is, okay, Sunil, tell me one thing that I can do to make sure that I'm successful. And at that time, I just kind of rolled my eyes saying, well, there's a whole reason why I interviewed over 300 people and 75 stories made it into the book, is that I didn't think that there was really one thing until I went back to the audio recordings. And when I did, 80 to 90% of them who I interviewed used some form of, I ignored my intuition, I should have trusted my gut, I knew what the right decision was, and I didn't make it. So there was something like that was really common to a lot of the people I interviewed. So it really got me thinking, okay, what is this thing called intuition? When did it hit my life? And I remember when I was trusting it, it was when I was 5 years old. And when I was 5, there was these video games that I wanted to buy. And my dad was saying, listen, they're too expensive. And so when I distinctly remember this voice saying, Sunil, go door to door to raise money. And that's exactly what I did. I went door to door. I raised $200. $100 went to my dad. The other $100 went to charity because that was something that I felt really good to me. And then, of course, you talked about the 3 times when I ignored my intuition. And the first was the career that I got myself into. And as a South Asian male, there's really 4 doors that you can go through, which is a career. There's the doctor, lawyer, engineer, or failure. And so obviously I went through number 3. That happens, right? Luckily, I didn't pick number 4.
Yeah,
number 3
thank you.
was the yeah, exactly. But so I picked up door number 3. I got into engineering, even though my intuition was saying, listen, you're meant to be an entrepreneur. All these sort of breadcrumbs of things that I did when I was younger in terms of selling suits and doing presentations and even on bake sales and doing some marketing stuff, even when I was younger, that stuff all pointed to being an entrepreneur. But I drank the East Indian Kool-Aid. And 2 years into that 3-year stint, I got a chance to become a private investor with a restaurant that I got involved with. And pretty soon, I was making 5 times more in dividends with the restaurant than I was actually making as a civil engineer. And so in year 3, I quit. My dad's relationship with me had tanked, and we no longer spoke when he found out I did that.
Oh,
But that was a necessary sacrifice that I needed to do if I wanted to be happy, right? Trusting my intuition. And then $20 million later, six or seven different ventures. it was clear to me that entrepreneurship was really what I was meant to do and to be. And then I became a management consultant helping other businesses. And in that process, there was this huge contract I got in Silicon Valley. It was amazing, but the contract terms started changing. And so my intuition at the time was saying, you better back off. But I was so emotionally invested in this because it's Silicon Valley, lots of dollars. And so I went down there and spent every penny going down there, and the company didn't pay me. And so I ended up coming back up to Canada with 25 cents in my bank account. I was about to be married in a couple of years.
Oh, wow.
And I'm driving up. My wife's saying, "How's it going, honey?" And I said, "Great." And while I'm saying that, I'm just wondering, where am I going to sleep that night? And so, the most devastating one was when I was in engineering and I was doing some personal coaching at the time. And one of my good friends reached out to me. She was being stalked at the time. And so she said, "Sunil, I really need to get some advice from you." And so my intuition was saying that evening or that afternoon, meet with her. It was really urgent. But for some dumb reason, I said, "No, you know what? Let's meet a couple of days later." The very next day, that same gentleman actually stalked her and followed her to a bus shelter. And he pulled out a gun and shot her in the head and killed her.
Oh, no.
And it was just devastating. So when I reflect back on these times when I ignored my intuition, I just said, okay, like each time I knew that I should trust this thing called intuition, why did I ignore it? And why did I trust it in at some other time? So I really needed to find out why. And so to me, intuition was kind of a blend of art and science. The art part were these things called intuitive signals. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But these signals that were telling me what the right decisions were and the wrong decisions were to make. And so that was sort of the art part. And then, there's a science part saying, well, I'm an engineer, and if I'm going to write a book on intuition, then if I'm going to write a book for the masses, who am I to talk about it? And everything at that time, we're going back to 2013, 2014-ish. And that's at that time, intuition was more spiritual in nature, cosmic and all that. So, I had to say, okay, there's got to be some science behind this. This has to be. And so lo and behold, when I looked at the academic research, there were MRIs, brain scans showing where it was. Infants as young as 2 months old had shown to have intuitive capabilities. There was research that showing it actually happens 7 to 10 seconds. Intuition hits you 7 to 10 seconds before you actually make a decision or take an action. And recent research, I've been told by a colleague, because the research methodology has gotten better, it's as early as 23 seconds before we actually make a decision or take an action. So there's all this research that's going on. And so it was, I think, like, wow, that's great. And
That
in
is
my
so
book, Gut.
cool.
Yeah.
Pause for just 1 second. So when you're saying that it's showing up, is there some signal in the brain where you notice one thing and then the decision happens? Is that what you're talking about? Like you feel something before you do it? Is that what you mean?
Absolutely. And so let's talk from a scientific perspective. So what happens is when your neurons hit the amygdala, which is your fight or flight place, that's the first place, and that's where intuition manifests itself. So that's where you start feeling things are happening. So everything like language and decision making and taking action happens after, because this is the first place anything happens. So it's really the first point of contact, so if you will, for when intuition hits you, and there's no language around it. And that's why it's, when I talk about a definition of intuition, everybody's definition is going to be different, because it's your language, my language, everybody's has a different language, different set of values that are trying to envelop this thing called intuition, which is really an intangible thing,
Right.
which science shows happens right at the amygdala stage. And that's the research that shows 23 seconds is actually looking at the amygdala and what happens when intuition hits the amygdala and when
Very
the brain
cool.
lights up.
Very cool.
So scientifically, that's where it is. And decision making comes afterwards. The actions and decision making. This is when the neurons then go to the frontal lobe, which is sort of where the rational part
Where the
is.
decision part.
Exactly.
Right.
And so there's a bit of time, and we're talking about 200 miles an hour, 300 miles an hour. So the time is really kind of a split second, but it's still, there's that quote unquote gap there, that intuition, then sort of thoughts, behaviors, and then actions. And that's sort of the sort of cascading effect. And it's really between those 7 to 10 seconds back then, or 23 seconds, that we really kind of screw it up. And so when I started interviewing over 1,000 people, I really found there were three groups of people that I found. The first group are the ones that absolutely get it. And so there was I had a Buddhist monk on my podcast series who lives his life on intuition. There was an international psychic, Elizabeth April, who talks about as an energy form. We just have it. And she says that the research just hasn't got to the point where people really understand it. And it's their belief system that really kind of holds them back from trusting it. But she gets it. Like, she lives her life all on intuition and these signals. Then the second group of people are the ones that kind of talk about it, but they don't walk the talk.
Gotcha.
And a friend of mine, and there's a lot of people that talk about, not a lot, there's some people that talk about manifestation, being in the present moment, and social media is full of these things. But then people don't really live their life like that. It's great as buzzwords, but they don't actually live it. And I've got colleagues of mine who are posting these great memes up on there, or themes on social media, or messages, but behind the scenes I know kind of what life they're leading. And it's great if it's inspirational, but
Right.
in some cases, then they should be inspired by their what they're putting out there,
I think it's a
and live
good
their
idea.
life like
Yeah,
that.
like if you're going to say it, if you believe it yourself, it's a lot more convincing.
Exactly. And there was a colleague of mine, Hal Eisenberg, and I met him through this whole dialogue between, he was sort of in mindset and I was in intuition. So there's a natural sort of cross section there. So we became colleagues because of that. And then he heard me speak, and he came to one of my talks. And then what happened is this intangible called intuition became really crystallized for him with signals and the four types of intuition and four hurdles that he heard me speak about. And he never thought about intuition like that. And then the signals started coming when he actually contracted COVID-19. And the intuitive signals were saying to him, you need to go to the hospital. And he's like, this, that. It's again, talking about being mindset and paying attention to your body and all that stuff. That was his lingo. And he just didn't live it, right? And so he ended up in a New York hospital, and he ended up having a life or death moment. He actually wanted to die himself. He was
Oh,
fighting so hard for his breath, but intuition told him, "You are not done yet. You have a voice. You have a stage. You need to speak." And how he made decisions, how he felt in that moment, was so crystal clear. And he also realized at that moment that he wasn't living life like that. He kind of talked about it, but it was clear that in the things that he made, reflecting back, he says, yeah, I talked about it, mindset and this, and that. I didn't live it. And so 5 days after he came out of the hospital, I was one of the first ones that he talked to at length about what he went through. And he was my very first podcast guest for my podcast series.
hmm,
And what a way to start a podcast series on intuition than someone who almost died, and really truly believed in what intuition is now, and how I talk about intuition is really crystallized to help him understand how it behaves so that he can trust it. And then the last group of people are the ones that they don't believe that
hmm.
intuition exists. And one of the very first interviews I had was a gentleman. It was a friend of mine, John Rothschild, and John was the CEO of and chairman of CEO of Cara Operations Limited back then, and he's since retired. But he said, "Look, Sunil, I'll give you an hour. I don't know what we're going to talk about. I just don't get these things called intuition. Now, this is an investment banker. Data, experience, spreadsheets, that ruled everything in his life." And
Right.
remember, at the time, everybody's talking about omens. They're talking about spirituality, and there's nothing wrong if you think that that's where intuition comes from. My
Right.
role is not to shove a definition down your throat. It's how you want to define it. Remember, intuition is that intangible. You're the one that puts the language around it, not me and not John. It's you. So if you think it's spiritual nature, great. I'm just here to say this is a subconscious phenomenon for you. It's important you use it. So John sits down. He says, okay, we'll talk for 5 minutes, and the rest of the hour, let's just catch up. Let's have a nice latte and feel, what are you up to? And clearly, I said, well, John, I'm up to intuitionology. So I turn the cameras on, and it's very clear from his language. He's saying, you know what? I really wish I could shake the hand of that person who sees omens. I just don't get it. And he's talking about some of the decisions he made in business, and he says, yeah, I'm just not convinced that intuition's a part of it. And so that's how we're starting.
Hmm.
But there's four types of intuition that I'll talk about. And one of the first ones is called experiential intuition. One of the things that you do when you're born is that your intuition is part of is in the subconscious area of your brain. As you experience things in life. And it's been shown, research shows that infants make 6,000 decisions a day. We make 32,000 decisions a day. So intuition is picking up all these relevant experiences, parking them in the subconscious area like a library. So when you're making a decision, it's going to pull apart whatever relevant experiences, good and bad, formal and informal, that you've had in the past. That's going to help inform the decision that you have to make. And so in John's case, his intuition absolutely relied on his past experience and learning, because it was a big part of what he had. And in some cases, it goes against the data. And so when I said that, he kind of said, yeah, well, I had a situation like that as well. So he was in the restaurant area industry, and he was opening up franchise locations. And so he put a franchise location at a five. It was listed as a 5.5 out of 10, when he never opened up anything that was less than a 9 out of 10. But his intuition and his partner's intuition was saying, we got to put something there. And that ended up being the most profitable franchise location, a franchise run called the Beer Market, under his portfolio of restaurants that he had. And so now, and he's saying, I think it was an intuitive decision. So I've moved him now from I don't think it exists to I think. And so we keep talking a bit more, and I start educating him a little bit more about intuition and get him to tell me more stories about when he thinks intuition played a role. And he's getting more and more convinced. And at the very end, there's another type called creative intuition. And creative intuition gives you the ability to make some decisions that are so obtuse that people think you're nuts. So I asked him, did you ever make a decision like that? He goes, oh, Sunil, of course I made it. And now his body language is positive. He's using intuition in his language. You can just tell he gets it. And so he says, yeah, listen, this guy was an investment banker, probably making $3 to $4 million a year, high-end restaurants, private jets, limousines, the whole 9 yards. And he wanted to quit everything to run a tiny, bankrupt little restaurant.
Oh.
Everybody thought he was nuts. But he talked to his wife, and he tells his wife, this just feels right. And he knew that was his intuition telling him that this was the right decision. He quit investment banking, rolled up his sleeves, and he walked into that tiny bankrupt little restaurant. That restaurant, Eastside Mario's location number 1. And over the next 20 years, he grew that to over 1,000 locations under different brand names, including the Beer Market, which I told you about earlier. $2 billion in revenues before he retired.
Oh, wow.
And all because of an intuitive decision. And the other two types of types, so we've got experiential and now we have creative. The other two are situational and relational. Situational intuition is one where you can walk into a room and you feel that something is off.
Oh, yeah.
And so I often say, when my wife and I went shopping for a house, we can instantly, when the door is open, instantly knew whether this is a house or a home. If it was a house, we just turn around. We wouldn't even go to the walkthrough. Yeah, and if it was a home, then it was a possibility. A great case was this. I had an interviewee, Krista Nasser, and Krista had lost her vision after 18, and she became blind. And so she had a service dog. And so one of the questions I asked her is that, how did your intuition get quote unquote replaced because you lost your sight? And so she was saying that her intuition actually came from her service dog. So when her service dog sensed a situation that was different, the service dog would tense up, and she can feel it through the leash. And so there was one where she would walk into an alleyway or some street all the time, every single day. And there happened to be one time where her service dog just tensed up, and she felt his intuition through the leash or through the dog. And so she basically said, we're going to take another route. And the last one is called relational intuition. And relational intuition is that where we're watching the other person, looking at body twitches. We're seeing if they're trustworthy. And research shows that we can trust someone in 14 seconds. And so we're making sure, can we trust that person? Are the actions matching the words? What's the body saying? And it uses as a base, like if someone's naturally nervous, intuition is going to use that as a base. And it's the detraction from that base which is really important. And the other thing intuition is also going to do is it's always on, right? So it's like a camera, it's always taking snapshots. So let's say someone's in a relationship, and then that other person's values change, and it goes really against your values. your intuition is it's going to give second chances, but it's at some point where your life is at danger or things are just way too different. It's going to start sending you these things called intuitive signals that are going to tell you to get out of the relationship. And one of the interviewees I had was Sabrina Pearson, and she was one of these. She was involved as a news anchor. She saw this guy, and she says, "Oh, she felt, she loved this guy." And she
Mm-hmm.
says, "Oh, she knew instantly. Her intuition was saying, this guy's going to ruin my career."
Oh, shoot.
And sure enough, she ignored that. She ended up dating him, and he ended up becoming very abusive, involved in drugs, involved in alcohol. She was not even in that scene whatsoever. And one night she wanted to leave, and she was an anchor, so she was a very public figure at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so she decided to say, no, this is it. And so he says, well, let's do it for one last time. So he ripped off her clothes, and then put a knife to her neck.
Oh, great.
And
That's a healthy relationship.
yeah, and so she just ignored the signals. The signals were always there, and this is the relational one because she could read this person, and she knew even before she met him that
Now,
he was bad news.
please tell me she got out okay.
She got out okay.
Okay.
So she was a public figure that ended up being in the news. She got fired. But what was most important is she had a daughter at the time, and she just said, "I've got to trust this intuition. I have a daughter. This can't happen again." And so she went and got help, and she actually took action, and that really kind of helped get her into more of a better relationships after the fact. So those are the four types of intuition, and I talked about signals. We all have a unique set of signals that are unique to each one of us because your experiences are going to be different than mine. So we all have a basket of positive signals, and we have a basket of negative signals. Typical positive signals I've heard are things like the dots connecting, a pull, a flow, feeling a flow, or just it just feels right.
Mm-hmm.
And a number of the negative signals are going to be like a negative voice or that gut feeling, the hairs on the back of the neck standing up, and in some cases, someone's seen an orb that's floating.
Oh, really?
And a really interesting one is one of the gentlemen I interviewed, Chris Dyson, was an entrepreneur, and when he came on board, he didn't know what his signals were. He says, "Yes, I'm not sure. I just don't know what it is, what they are." But every time he started talking about a business venture that he got into that failed, or he went in for the wrong reasons, he kept grabbing his left earlobe, and
Fascinating.
it just dawned on him. He said, "Wow, that's my signal, Sunil." And he remembers getting into those adventures and feeling it weird that his left earlobe is getting hot. He remembers talking to his wife about how bad those businesses were at the time, and he remembers his left earlobe getting hot. So, again, these are very unique signals, and so
Fascinating.
for your listeners,
Yeah.
it's about them just paying attention, looking back at the decisions they made, good or bad, and pay attention to what did you feel at the moment. And one of the things that you have to keep nagging at that question, because let's say you had a bad decision and it happened to be a voice that told you not to go there.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know if that voice was signal number 1 or signal number 3. If it was signal number 1, you're okay. That was your first signal, and Oprah calls it kind of a whisper. If it's signal number 3, what happens is there were 2 other signals that you haven't identified that you ignored. And so that means that you made 2 bad decisions. So those 2 bad decisions could be just a stub toe, or you could be headed towards bankruptcy. You just don't know. And that's why it's important to really spend the time to understand how your intuition behaves, to understand just at a bare minimum what your signals are. And once you have those inventory of signals, then every decision you make is going to be the right one, because one of those signals is going to come up. If it's positive, obviously make the decision. If it's negative, don't make the decision. And if you've missed and you made a bad decision, don't blame intuition, because some people do that. You've missed a signal. And if you've missed a decision, it's not because of intuition. It's because of one of 4 intuitive hurdles that we can talk about.
Oh, yes, please. What are the hurdles?
So there's 4 intuitive hurdles that really, really affect your ability. And then what they do is they essentially squash the signals that you have. The biggest one is fear. Fear of change, fear of failure, fear of the unknown. And what that does is that when it squashes your signals, then you start, you're blind making a decision because you don't know what the signals are. And what you have to do is when fear comes up, or any one of these hurdles, this is where you need to really pay attention to the subtle signals, because the subtle signals are the ones that they're not able to quiet. Yeah.
So, as what you're saying with the hurdle of fear is that you feel maybe one of those signals, but then you don't want to do it because it's scary or you're afraid to follow it. Is that what we're talking about?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So
I'm
it's
with
it's
you.
a, it's a, it's a new direction. You have to get out of a situation, but that fear comes in, and so this is where you really have to pay attention to the signals, because it's a different, fear is different. A signal that's different for a saber-toothed tiger going to eat you is different, because that's when you got to go. But if it's a signal that's saying yes, this is a positive signal, even though you're fearful, you know that there's a positive signal there. So that's what you follow, and you take the next step. And a great example of this is, there's a fellow I interviewed, David Dame, who had cerebral palsy. And so he was on vacation, and all he wanted to do was dip his toe in the sand and in the ocean. Never done it before. And so his friends wheeled him into the ocean, close to the ocean, and he steps up and he puts his feet in the on the sand, and he falls flat forward, and he was incredibly embarrassed. So he had one of two choices to make. One was to get up and sit back in the chair and forever regret that he never was able to fulfill his dream of just dipping his toe in the ocean. Or he could trust his intuition and move past the fear and take the next step, and take the next step, and take the next step. And he decided to trust his intuition. He kept going. His friend said, "Did you want to turn back?" And he hadn't even looked back. He says, "No, I want to keep going." And he kept going until the water got up to his neck. And then he turned around, and he had said, "I hadn't realized how far I had come." And so that's what living in the present moment is like. That's what trusting your intuition is like. It's like you can reach whatever goals that you want, but you have to take the steps towards that, guided by intuition, to reach those. So that's fear.
Okay. And the next one?
The next one is called ego, and there's two types of ego. And so the ego is, one side of the ego is the narcissism, but the other side of ego is following the herd. And interestingly, when David was coming back onto the beach, he met a gentleman. And what would happen in most cases, this is where you kind of follow the herd, is that David fell down, and this other gentleman was watching him. And if David had got back in his wheelchair, this other gentleman wouldn't have attempted to go in the water, because he wanted to follow the herd, essentially. And so when David came back, he asked this gentleman, the gentleman said, "Oh, it was so brave of you to actually go through and take the first steps." And David says, "Oh, were you inspired by me actually making those steps?" He goes, "No." He was saying that if you fell into the water and you are dumb enough to get up and move ahead, then I can do the same thing. And so, and so this is where ego, like if David had not, then most people don't. And they follow other people, and they follow the herd without taking the steps that may go against what the herd is, or follow a group because they're cool, or they're popular, or they have a brand name, or
Right.
you get caught up in that herd mentality because everybody else is doing it, and then you don't trust your intuition to go a different way.
A different thing.
Go ahead.
It sounds a little bit like, also, if you are courageous enough to follow your intuition, it helps give other people the courage to follow theirs.
Yes.
So
Absolutely.
It can be kind of a ripple effect for good or for bad, depending on whether you listen or don't.
Absolutely. And you just have to make sure that you're following the right people that you've really, really filtered, that are going to really be there for the ups and downs, and who are really authentic. And when I talk about authentic, that word gets thrown out a lot. These are people who are really there for you to move your life forward. These aren't yes people. These are people who will give you constructive criticism, but when you need them the most for whatever advice, they're there, and they're going to give you honest feedback. And those are going to change. Your inner circle is going to change, because it could be that your values change. It could be that their values change. It could be that they're not in tune with their intuition and you are. And so it's okay for those to ebb and flow, as long as who you keep in the inner circle are always the ones that are closest to you, in that you trust and
Hmm.
that are really there to see you move ahead. And so
Excellent.
that's the ego side. The other one is called being too rational. And being too rational is, again, following societal norms. And this is where I had fallen into with my engineering, going on what the South Asian community wanted to do. And another colleague of mine, Bobby Umar, fell into this, where he went into engineering and did the MBA and the marketing thing, when he was really someone that wanted to, do comedy. He wanted to actually, be an entrepreneur, a speaker, and now he's now an expert in enhancing a personal brand. And so again, he's a South Asian, but his parents saying, like, "What are you doing?" And he fell into that trap, and he wasted so much time doing that. And now he's doing very, very well. And the last is being too emotional. And this is typically what happens in relationships, where you end up you're way too emotional, and you start second guessing yourself. You talk yourself back into a relationship. And a great example of this is Sarah Prout. Sarah was in a 10-year relationship, 40 instances of abuse, and she kept going back again and again. And her intuition, the signals were there, and they were getting louder and louder, until one night, it was December 31st, she finally had a signal that was loud enough. She was looking at the stars, and it was that time the intuition said, "It's now. You have to do it." And so this is someone who was on welfare, $30,000 in debt, two kids, and she left. And so she had to pick up furniture from the side of the road. She went to public washrooms and put pieces of soap together so that her kids can shower at home.
Wow.
And so that's what she faced, but she trusted her intuition that the doors of opportunity are going to keep opening up, and this is a better life. And sure enough, 6 years later, not only did she meet the love of her life on Twitter after a year, and they ended up getting married, she's now running a multi-million-dollar business in manifestation, all because she trusted her intuition. Now, I'm not saying that when you trust your intuition, you're going to become a multimillionaire. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, when you trust your intuition, these doors of opportunity open up, and success starts coming from inside of you. And then you start reaching your goals. And if those goals are going to be a successful entrepreneur, it's great. So you can have these things like a 6 or 7 figure business, but you don't want to have that as an extrinsic motivation. It has to come intrinsically to you, and you have to take those steps, just like David Dame did, to get into the water. One more step, and one more step, and one more step. And that's how you reach your goals. And that's how you reach success. And success is a journey. It's never a destination. But when you start trusting your intuition based on the signals, every single part of your life will be successful internally. You define success. It's not defined by others.
I like that. I like that. Oh, thank you. That is such good advice, and I really appreciate it. And as you're telling me these stories, I'm thinking of stories of friends and associates that I have, and how things just line up, and the things that you're teaching are true. And you can see that when you see that pattern repeated throughout.
Yep.
And I
Absolutely.
appreciate that what you've kind of done here is created maybe a vocabulary that most people are familiar with, or comfortable with, maybe not familiar. Like you said, a lot of people think that this intuition is more of a spiritual thing, and it's not for educated, rational people. And by giving it the name and explaining the psychology and the physiology behind it, it makes it feel more accessible, if that makes sense,
Yes, absolutely.
to the masses, to just anyone. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you. In
No problem.
closing, I'd like to share a quote from Forbes magazine, which says, "Intuition is the highest form of intelligence." So today, I invite you to pay attention to your intuition so that you can make better decisions in your life. See you next time on Linda's Corner.